200, 300 or 400 years ago, and I'm going to tell you the original version of the vampire story. Okay, it's not too bad. Some of you are looking a bit worried, like, oh. But it's different. And all of these stories were taken by people in Hollywood, and they changed the way the stories sounded. This is the original version. All right. So I'll tell you the story, and then lots of other things will be going on. There was a woman, and this woman was old, and she lived in a house, a huge house, and she had had a family. Now this family, she had had not 1, not 3, not 5, but 7 children. And it was a huge house. And inside of the house, all of her children would smile, they would sing, they would laugh. But time had gone, and they had grown taller and stronger and bigger, and now they were just like you, young men and young women, and they'd gone away from that house. And now the old woman lived in the house by herself. And there was only her voice, it was only her laughter, and she would sit by the fire by herself, and she was lonely. This house was too big for just one old woman, and she wondered, what can I do? Now, beside where she lived, there was a village. There were trees, but a village nonetheless. And there were men, there were women, there were girls, there were boys, and there were 19 young men and 20 young women. And she would go to the middle of the town. She didn't want to be in the house by herself. And it took a lot of courage. She stood in the middle of the square and she shouted at the top of her voice, all of you, please, I'm an old woman by myself in a huge house. Would anyone please come to my house and sit by my fire, eat with me, talk with me? And one of the young women was taller and stronger and more handsome than the rest. And she stood up and she said, old woman, I would wish to come into your house and I will sit with you. And if you could teach me how to cut cloth. You could teach me how to stitch and to sew. And the old woman smiled, of course, you are welcome to come into my house. And I've told you, taller, stronger, more handsome and clever, better than the rest. And she said to another girl, it's a good place inside of the house. You should go. The old woman, she smiles and she sings and she laughs. And soon, it wasn't just one young woman, or 2, or 5, or 10. All 20 of the young women would go inside of the old woman's house. They would talk, they would sit, they would smile, they would sing and laugh. And where there are young women, there are young men. And they would stand outside by the door and they would say, please, could I walk you home? Please, would you let me take you to your house? And of course, one by one, these young women, they found a young man who would walk with them and sit with them. And there were 19 young men and there were 20 young women. And the one who was taller than the rest, stronger than the rest, more handsome, cleverer than the rest. Perhaps some of the young men were frightened of her, and she did not have a young man who would hold her hand or walk arm in arm. And this is a terrible thing to say, because the young men and young women would whisper behind their hands. They would talk about her. They would say, she is too clever, she is too beautiful, she is too strong. And she hated it. She would have to sit by herself and see everyone else, a man and a boy, a man and a woman together, and they would be there, and she was by herself. And then one night, as the rain came down and the lightning flashed, the door to the place opened, and there was a figure of a man, tall and thin, but his skin was as white as milk. His lips were as red as blood. And he stood in the doorway as the lightning flashed behind him, and his shadow was cast upon the ground. And as he stood in the doorway, he said, invite me in. She did not wait for a single heartbeat. She went over to the door. She'd been by herself, and the others had spoken about her. And she went. Now, this is a story from a long time ago, and what she did would have been shocking. For as soon as he was at the door, she wrapped herself about him with her arms, and she kissed him upon his cheek, and his chin, and his lips. And all of them looked. And if they had spoken about her before, now they had something that they could talk about. A stranger at the door. And she kissed him without even speaking a word to him. But she dragged him inside of the house to sit by the side of the fire. He had a cloak on his back that went from his neck to his feet. But when he sat down and pulled the cloak up, the old woman looked. And instead of having feet, he had the hooves of a horse. And the old woman looked. She said to her, "You must not bring him into this house. There is something about him, and I do not like him." But did the young girl listen? No. She needed a friend, and there he was. And by the side of the fire, she kissed him, and she held him. And the others did not like this. They all moved away, until there was only the old woman and the girl and this strange man with his milk-white skin, his blood-red lips, and his eyes that were like gold. And as they sat, she started to fall asleep. And when she awoke the next morning with the sun in the sky, he was gone. The old woman said, "You must look. He is not of this world. He is not like us. You must not invite him in. And look to his feet." But would she listen? No. Again, at the tick and tock of midnight, he came to the door, "Invite me in," and she did not wait. She rushed to him. She pulled him down. She pulled him by his side. And that night, when everyone else had gone, she lay down beside him by the fire's glow. And when the fire had died and she was asleep, he had gone. The next day, the old woman said, "You must not lie with him. You must not kiss him. You must not hold him. For he is not of this world, and his feet are not like ours, with toes and skin. For he has the hooves of a horse. What you must do is find out where he goes when the moon is gone and the sun arises. And to do it, you must do this." And here she gave her a needle, sharp, long, thin, and silvery. And she gave her some thread. She said, "You must stitch it into his skin, stitch it into his back, and follow it." He came. He sat down. And when he was not looking, she took a long, thin, sharp needle and stitched it into his back, into his bones at his back. And when she fell asleep, the thread in her hand rolled out. For as he'd gone, it followed behind him. And when she awoke, she looked, and there she saw it went out of the door. It went through all of the trees. It went through a graveyard, and then it went down and into the ground. She didn't wait for a single sigh. She started to pull at the ground with her hands. She moved the grass, the dirt, the soil, and then she found a coffin. And the thread went inside. And when she lifted the lid, there he lay, still with the thread stitched into his back, skin as white as milk, lips as red as blood. And when she looked at him, she screamed, Can I just say, usually when I tell that story, I go, oh, and I have my eyes closed. But I must admit, I kept my eyes open that time, and it was like, you've got to understand these stories. Thank you. Okay, so these stories, the storytellers, before television and before movies and before texts and all of those things, a storyteller would be asked to come and tell a story. Now, I'll tell you something, you will remember that you jumped. Did you jump? So anyway, so there she looked, and as he lay there, she ran away from that place. She was frightened. She did not know what to say or to do. But when she sat by the side of the old woman's fire, the old woman said, I told you you should not have sat with him. You should not have kissed him upon his cheek and chin. And then there was a knock on the door. Can you put your hands like this? Everybody, do it now. Everybody. There was a knock. I haven't done it yet. There was a... I so nearly did it. Okay. I love it. No, it wasn't me. So it was his. She did it. There was a 1, 2, 3, knock on the door. And she looked, and there he stood, his shadow upon the ground. Tell me what you saw. Never! I will never tell you or anyone. And the old woman stood between him and the girl, and she ran as if her life depended upon it. She ran till she came to her own house. And then when she got there, there was a knock on the door. You are so good. There was a knock. Usually it sounds like this. There was a knock, and he stood there. Tell me what you saw. Never. I will never tell you or anyone, but leave me alone. If you do not tell me, then I shall kill your father. She closed the door and locked it. But the next night, when she looked down, and there upon the ground she found the body of her father, and the blood on the ground was as deep as a man's thumb. Again, on the second night, hey, you are so good. On the second night, there was a knock on the door. He said, tell me what you saw, or I shall kill your mother. I will never tell you or anyone. The next morning, the body of her mother was there upon the ground, and the blood was as deep as a man's hand. The third night, he said, if you do not tell me, you shall die. She would not tell him. And when people came to that house, the blood was as deep as a man's hand. And the sun would shine, and all of the blood became smaller and stickier and thicker, until there was just one piece of thick, dried blood. And from out of it there grew a flower, a beautiful flower, with leaves that were as red as blood. Leaves and flower, and when you looked at it, it would glow when the moon would shine. Everyone became frightened of the house. They knew the story, and no one would go in, and trees would grow about the house. And the stories would be told by the darkest of nights. But there was a prince, and as he rode past that place, as he looked through the trees, he could see a strange light. And he looked and asked, he said, what is it inside of those trees? And he was told the story of the woman and the man with the milk-white skin. And he wanted to see that flower. He raised his sword high in the air, and he cut his way through all of those trees. I like the fact you were ready though. He cut his way through all of those trees. And then he went and he found the flower, and he looked at it. He could not believe his eyes. He was fascinated by it. He cut it out of the ground that was inside where the house had been, and he took it back to his home, the castle. He placed it at the end of his bed, so the last thing that he saw at night was the flower, and the first thing that he saw in the morning was the flower. He said to his father, my father, last night I had the strangest of dreams. I dreamt that there was a beautiful woman. Everybody show me your beautiful faces. Do it now. Beautiful faces like this. Okay, most of them. Okay, so there was a beautiful beautiful woman, and she was there at the bottom of the bed. The king said, "My son, it is just a dream." But the next night he said again, my father, there was a beautiful woman, and she lay down by my side and kissed me upon my cheek and chin." He could see that his son was becoming tired. His skin was becoming white. And he asked an old man, he said, "My son thinks that there is a beautiful woman who appears in his bed at night." The old man smiled. "What he must do is this." And he told the king. He told the king that he must watch. And the king sat at his son's bed. And that flower rose up into the air. And as it got higher, it turned itself upside down. The roots to the sky and the rose flower to the bottom. And from out of it there stepped that beautiful woman. The king looked. The king was frightened. But he watched as this woman went and lay down by his son's side. He said to the old man, "What must I do? I do not wish this. This is sorcery. This is magic. This is something that I do not like." The old man said, "Your son, when the flower rises up in the air and turns around, when the woman steps out, he must hold her tight and in his arms, and he must not let her go until the sun comes up in the sky." The son was told this. He watched. He could not believe it. The flower went up in the air. It turned itself around. And as soon as the woman stepped out, he grabbed hold of her. But listen, as soon as he touched her, her skin was covered with thorns, with small blades. And as he held onto her, she writhed and screamed. I was hoping for some help. I'm so pleased. She writhed and she screamed. I said, she screamed. She screamed and he held on to her. She fought just like a dragon. She cut at his skin. The blood fell down. But when the sun came up, all of the knives and blades and thorns in her skin fell to the ground. And she stood there, as beautiful as she had ever been. And he held her. And in that house, they became the best of all friends. And friends became love. And love became friendship that would last forever. And they had, by the time that 3 seasons had gone across the sky, they had a child. But one night, when their child was no more than 1 year old, there was a great and a terrible You are fantastic. You make a happy man old. But the thing is this. Do you know, they looked and there he stood. "That child is mine." The woman said, "Never. Give me that child. The child is mine." Never. And twice he had asked. "Give me the child." She said, "No. This child was born from love." And as soon as those words of love had passed her lips, a wind blew. And as he stood in the doorway, he was engulfed in all of the goodness inside of that castle. And here his heart exploded inside of his chest. And there he sank down to the ground as nothing more than dust. And from that time, he was never seen at their doorpost, no more knocks upon the door, and they lived well, but she would never, by the heart of midnight when the moon was in the sky, she would never open the door when she heard a knock upon the door. You have been absolutely marvellous, so muchísimas gracias y adiós. I'm not. You ready? There was an old woman. This old woman lived by a huge stream, but the stream ran red with blood, and she did not like to be in that place. And she hoped that someday, when the sun would shine, she would remember when her sons would come back from the war. There you go. Thank you very much. I'll play the banjo if you will go.
Foto.